Hey, this is former Blue Devil lineman Matt Skura. You're listening to Basketball Conference, the ACC football podcast. Go Duke, go ACC.
Welcome back into Basketball Conference, the ACC football podcast. My name is Mike McDaniel. I'm excited for this podcast today. We're recording on August the 12th. This is the first podcast I have done covering this particular program. There's going to be three of them, of course, and I don't think anybody listening to this podcast will be confused about the three new teams in the ACC, but the Cal Golden Bears. We are doing a season preview. Can't say I've ever expected to say that. Welcoming in Matt Moreno from Rivals, covers the West Coast teams out there, including the Cal Golden Bears. Matt, what's going on, man? Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's obviously been an interesting time to be covering a team that's playing, in the Atlantic Coast Conference. That's very, very close to the Pacific Ocean. So, been a very entertaining time. I think there's a lot of excitement out on our coast, and I'm just happy to be here and glad to be part of this for you guys.
It's we're really glad to have you. And I mean, naturally, the first question, and we've been making the joke on our podcast, calling it the All Coast Conference now, because that's what really this is. It's really strange that Cal is now a member of the ACC, Cal and Stanford, then of course SMU coming in from Texas to be a part of the ACC. As a member of the media, going through this whole conference realignment, I know it's been different for everybody, but as somebody who's covering these West Coast schools, what has this transition been like? How strange was it with like covering ACC Media Day, for example, and just like really immersing yourself covering a program or a couple programs that are a part of the ACC now?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been doing this for going on 14 years now, and so it's like, I got used to covering teams in the Pac-12, got used to a lot of the faces within the Pac-12, and so you show up to the media days and you're like, I don't know a lot of these people. I've seen them on TV. I've seen them kind of from afar, but I don't feel like I have any kind of connection with, these people that I'm looking at. And so I think there's a certain level of excitement there that you're like, okay, there's some new faces, there's some new people, some new teams, new venues to look at and assess and visit. But it's just been really odd, across the board. I covered some, I went to the Big 12 Media Day as well in Las Vegas, and it's just really strange. It's just really strange seeing these different faces, these different logos. It's crazy because you're looking at these teams and you're like, I know the teams that I cover, like I'm familiar with them, but even they feel kind of out of place in a lot of these places because they're like stepping in. They're kind of like the new kid in school where they're like, all right, we're trying to figure out the lay of the land ourselves and figure out, what it's going to be like, in a different part of the country. And so it's been really interesting to kind of see it all play out. And, that whole process, watching it play out, was you kind of experienced it in real time. And, a lot of this happened, during, a time when there's practices going on. So you're talking to coaches every day, trying to get their thoughts. And they're like, well, you can tell they're like, I don't know what to tell you or what I even know or what I'm being told and what I'm supposed to relay. But I think they were kind of caught in a gray area for quite a bit of it. And, Justin Wilcox out here at Cal was somebody who was like very, very intrigued about it. He wanted to make sure that his program was going to be in the best position. I think that was his priority. And his main thought throughout this entire ordeal was like, I don't know where we're going as a program, as Cal football, but we want to be in a power conference. We want to play at the highest level. And that's what we're telling our players. And so I think there was moments where it was like, we really don't know if you're Cal. I think there was kind of a moment that where you're like, you could still play in the Pac-12. You could still be a part of this, whatever the new Pac-12 was going to look like, you could be part of that. And so I think the desire all along was to move to one of the bigger conferences. I think there was obviously the thought of the Big Ten because you had, a few of the Pac-12 teams moving out there. And I think a lot of the ideals of what, Cal has in mind, obviously academics is huge for the Bay Area schools. And so I think that lined up a lot with the Big Ten. But I think athletically, you look at the ACC and you look at what they want to become, especially on the basketball side. It's a big deal. They have Mark Madsen, they have a new head coach who's going into his second season. I think there was a lot that appealed to them in other sports, baseball as well. They have a pretty solid baseball team. And so I think there were some other things that lined up with Cal that they're like, the ACC didn't make, it wasn't a complete kind of odd fitting. Obviously you have some growth to make with football. They've kind of tried to get over this hump of getting back over 500. We're able to make a bowl game last season. And so, I think there's some work to do there on the football side, but it doesn't feel as odd of a fit as I think everyone initially thought. I think everyone looked at the daunting kind of travel schedule and what that could potentially look like. And I think that was a bit scary to a lot of people who are making decisions and were involved in, the process at Cal. And that's kind of to be determined. You look at Cal's upcoming schedule, and it's like there's going to be a lot of travel, and there's been a lot of talk about that already in camp and how that's going to play out and what that's going to look like. Justin Wilcox is not somebody who's going to use that as any kind of excuse. He's kind of been pretty clear about that hey, the travel is not going to be, something that they lean on as a reason if they play bad this year. And so I think that was kind of the biggest thing. But when they kind of sat back and saw it all play out, I think it was the right decision for them to make. It was really interesting to kind of watch, like I said, because there was just a lot of unknowns. And I think that was the biggest thing for covering as a media person was there's just so many unknowns. People want to live in absolutes. Fans want to live in absolutes. And there just weren't a lot at that time. There were things that were changing, from day to day, sometimes hour to hour. And so that was kind of the difficult part of covering is like, you don't know what to believe. You don't know what could change. The ACC thing started kind of bubbling up, and it was like, okay, I think this is where it's maybe there's a lot of rumors out there. You're trying to sort through a lot of rumors and a lot of kind of, people just kind of throwing things at the wall there and hoping to see what sticks. And but behind the scenes, the ACC stuff kind of was like, all right, there might be some legs to this. And talking to people internally, that was the one that kind of it felt like Cal was going to gravitate toward. How it was going to work out, and outside of Stanford, who its partner could potentially be, was going to be kind of the intriguing part and the interesting part. But that was the one that really felt like it had legs as this whole process played out and really kind of got going. And it was obviously a pretty quick process, but the move to ACC kind of always felt like the one that was eventually going to happen for Cal, at least, when things really started getting rolling with all these teams moving around.
Yeah, once it kind of became clear the Big Ten situation wasn't going to materialize for Cal or Stanford, it did feel like the ACC was the most logical fit. I mean, you mentioned the academic portion of things with the ACC having Duke and Wake Forest and North Carolina and those types of academic, and UVA, like those types of academic institutions. But then on top of it, I mean, you talk about the sports outside of football. I mean, the ACC has been playing great basketball forever, and they have it's a very good baseball conference, like you mentioned, and Cal's got a very good baseball program. So it did seem to make sense. It was interesting though, watching how quickly the Pac-12 dissolved, and it just felt like everybody was kind of finding their new seat at the table. Then there was Cal and Stanford, and then there was Washington State and Oregon State. And we're all just kind of figuring out what's going to happen, and eventually Cal and Stanford get their natural fit in the ACC. I call it natural, just it's really unnatural, but natural in this new era that we're in. So I want to press on something that you just mentioned about Justin Wilcox not going to make an excuse for the travel. We'll get into the schedule later, but you mentioned Wilcox's mindset in terms of like, okay, we want what's best for the program. We want a seat at the table. But I'm hoping you can go a little bit more into detail on that as far as like his mindset throughout all of this, because it is tough having to ask or answer questions from the media time and time again when information is just flying all different directions about where these teams are heading, when it's going to happen. Is this team going to this conference? Is it not going to this conference? That's a lot of distractions for a Cal team that Justin Wilcox has been really trying to improve, especially in the offensive side of the football last couple seasons. So what has that been like, I guess, going into camp, and what has his mindset been about an entirely new schedule, an entirely set of new teams to play? What's his mindset been on the upcoming slate in this new conference?
Yeah, it was really interesting because if you know Justin Wilcox at all and know kind of his history with his family and himself as a player and a coach, he's really tied to the Pac-12. I mean, there was some genuine hurt on him when things started to fall apart, because I think he really, really values what the Pac-12 stood for. He was part of a ton of programs within the conference, coached at a lot of different places, played in the Pac-12 at one point. He has deep ties to the conference. And so the initial part of it was like, I think he was kind of coming to the realization like, hey, this thing that I grew up around and grew up with is over.
Yeah.
And I think that lasted a pretty long time. I mean, it was one of those things, even after everything was pretty settled, he really didn't want to discuss it. It was something that really waited until the off season in the summer, when he was really able to be like, okay, I'm willing to talk about this now. I'm willing to, really think about it. And I'll talk to you guys about it a little bit more. Once the season was over and everything kind of came to, it was kind of turning the page. And so I think there was some genuine kind of sadness with Justin Wilcox about how things kind of played out and how it kind of, disappeared really quickly. And so
Yep.
I think once he got over that, I think there was an excitement about, what was to come. I think he understands that it's, there's very talented football teams within the ACC. And I think he understands that there's going to be, some new challenges. And I think like everybody else, players included, there's an excitement about, taking on some of those new challenges and seeing some of these new venues and seeing some of these new teams and schemes that they haven't, necessarily seen before. And so I think there was some general excitement there with him. And again, I think most people in the game understand that this is not the end. This is kind of just a portion of what's going to come next. And so I think for a lot of programs, and I think Justin Wilcox included, it's about setting yourself up for the future and really wanting to be part of, the big dogs whenever the next change happens, which feels like it could be, relatively soon. And in terms of kind of how this stuff all goes. And so I think for him, it was just about understanding what was true and what wasn't. I think there was a moment in time where he was like, hey, you guys kind of know more than I do at this point. And so, that comment came up a couple of times, and sometimes that's coach speak and they just don't want to expand on kind of what they truly know. Right. And I'm sure he knew more than we did at that point. But, it was a question that came up every day. Every time we would talk to him after practice, it was like, hey, what's the update today? And sometimes there was nothing. And sometimes there was like, hey, we think something could potentially happen here soon. But again, his kind of steady thing was like, we want to play football against the best teams. I think he was very against a potential. There was a thought of like, hey, could the Pac-12 merge with the Mountain West? I think without saying it kind of outright, I think he was very against that idea. That was kind of just reading between the lines. Obviously, as a head coach, you don't want to say things and then have them happen and be like, hey, you're the coach that said you didn't want to be part of this conference. So I think there's still some kind of hesitancy to be like, hey, we're open to all options. But kind of saying it without saying it, I very much got the sense internally the thought of playing in a revised Pac-12 with a bunch of Mountain West teams was not ideal for Justin Wilcox. I think he wanted to make sure that wherever Cal ended up, it was a power conference. And so I never really truly got a sense that he had a priority or a preference rather that he wanted to go to the Big 10 or he wanted to go to whatever the Big 12 or whatever. I think it was just about continuing to play at the highest level, continuing to play at the Power 5 level, Power 4 level, and have an opportunity eventually to play for a college football playoff spot. And so Cal's not there yet, but I think that was the ultimate goal of like, hey, you want to set yourself up to have success, because I think he understood the uphill battle if Cal was not part of a power conference, the uphill battle in terms of selling transfers, which have been a big part of the program the last couple of years, selling recruits, which is already a difficult sell because you have the academic component, which is really hard. It's difficult to get into Cal and Stanford as well. It's just a difficult school to get into. And so you have different academic requirements that you can't offer every recruit. You have to kind of be more selective. And so I think that knowing all those things, it was like, hey, you can't also kind of hamstring us by putting us in a smaller conference where it's going to be an even more difficult sell of like, hey, we don't play in a power conference anymore, but still come to Cal. So I think there is a lot of elements to it. I think there are a lot of layers to it, but I think the thing that I felt pretty confident in hearing from what he was saying was like, hey, we don't want to play in a lower level conference really in any way. That was like, hey, that's the bottom thing. Like, we don't want to be part of that. We want to be part of a high level. And so I think if you'd ask him now, I think he'd be pretty excited and happy with where Cal ended up in the ACC.
Yeah, especially because there was a point in time there where it was pretty apparent the Pac-12, with the number of teams that were leaving, it was pretty apparent that even if the Pac-12 remained a conference, it was going to be much different. You mentioned all the Mountain West teams that were rumored at the time to potentially become a part of the conference. It was going to be clear it was going to be a step down in competition relative to the teams that left when you have teams like Oregon and Washington, obviously, and the battles they had last year. Washington, obviously, getting to a national championship game, and you have Utah, which has been year over year one of the top 15 programs in the country. It's really hard to replace that type of talent. So when those teams go out the door, the idea of playing basically in a modified Mountain West, I can understand why, even respectfully, right, for Justin Wilcox to not necessarily prefer to play that way. So I think landing in the ACC will serve him well, considering the teams that are in the conference, at least at this point in time. Looking back on last year's team, so Cal goes 6-7, they lose the bowl game. Jake Spavital came in, revived the offense over the last couple seasons. best year was last year. He leaves for Baylor. Matt Bloche comes in. How is this offense going to look schematically, right? Because I think a big priority, at least watching from afar, right, just as a college football fan, was, okay, Justin Wilcox is known for his defense, right? And he's going into his 8th year. Is that correct? 8th season?
That's correct. Yep.
So he's been around a while, and he's been known, it's been defense at Cal forever, right? Like, that's what Wilcox has been known for. And the sore spot in the down years for Cal, as he's trying to rebuild the program, is, okay, offensively, what is this going to look like? And it was only a matter of time, I guess, before Spavital got poached, right? Obviously, it was, Wilcox was lucky to land him as an OC, considering, where he was as a head coach beforehand, to kind of have him fall into your lap and revive this offense. Now he's gone. What is this offense going to look like schematically under Matt Bloche? And then kind of getting into the quarterback room, especially, you add Chandler Rogers from North Texas, Fernando Mendoza. I know he didn't start out the year last year as a starter, ended up playing a lot of snaps. So is there one quarterback over the other from a schematic standpoint that's going to fit better for what Bloche wants to run? And how do you expect the offense to fare in year one under Bloche versus what they did last year under Spavital, which has put together a pretty nice season?
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting kind of offseason from that perspective. And, Mike Bloche was really good about building the offensive line last season. And I think they made some strides, because that's been a negative part of this team in recent years, was the offensive line. And so it was paramount that he was able to improve that. And so I think he showed enough to kind of help himself earn that, OC job when Jake Spavital left to Baylor. And so they were left in a pretty good spot in terms of, the pieces they had coming back. Obviously, you mentioned Fernando Mendoza as a returning starting quarterback. But I think when you look at the offense and you kind of take that into account, that there are several returning pieces who are going to be key contributors, led by Jaden Ott, the running back,
Right.
Star running back. And so I think we truly won't see the Mike Bloche offense probably for another couple years. I think there's going to be this transition period. That's what it feels like right now. If you look at, what they've done in camp and what they've shown in camp, and compared to what we saw last year at this time, it doesn't look drastically different.
Right.
There's maybe a more dedication to running the ball, which is, there's a very clear reason why that would be the case with Jaden Ott back there. But that feels like it's going to be the priority. And Mike Bloche has kind of talked about that and has been pretty clear that they're going to run the ball, and that's going to be kind of the focus of their offense. But there's been some different wrinkles. I think Jake Spavital was just in town again so quickly that it was not long enough for him to really, I think, expand on what he wanted to do. You mentioned the quarterback issues. They played 3 different starting quarterbacks last year. There was no real leader of that pack even going into the season opener last year, and I think that was very clear to anybody who watched camp. And so I think it kind of handcuffed them a little bit in that they weren't able to really truly expand on what they wanted to do until really the end of the year. And so there's some elements of what Jake Spavital did, within what Mike Bloche wants to do. And he's been an offensive coordinator before. He was at North Texas previously and had those duties before he ended up at Cal as the offensive line coach last year, and then now as the OC. But I think the biggest wrinkle is in how much they want to stretch the field with the passing game. I think that's been something that they wanted to do last year and just didn't have maybe the personnel to do so. They really have bulked up the receiver group. They brought in some top transfers, several top programs. And so they look like a much different receiver group. They're a lot deeper. They're a lot more talented, especially with that starting rotation. And so I think they just have maybe more of the weapons to do some of the things that I think Jake Spavital wanted to do. And if you look at it again, it's not much different, but I think the biggest thing is you're going to see them try and go vertical, try and stretch the field quite a bit more often. And I think even have more dedication to the running game. And I joke that I couldn't be Cal's OC because I would hand the ball off to Jaden Ott about 50 times. Like, that would just be my game plan. I would get the ball in his hands as much as possible. And, just for, longevity and making sure that he stays out there and stays healthy, you just can't do that. But I think there's going to be a temptation at certain points this year to just get the ball in his hands as much as possible because he is their true game changer on that side of the ball. But, I think with the weapons they have on offense at the receiver position and at tight end as well, Jack Andrews is coming back as a returning starter at tight end. Feels like he's poised to have his best season. They brought in Corey Dyches from Maryland, who had a really strong season at tight end. Kind of gives him a versatile, flexible weapon where he kind of looks like a receiver but can play some tight end. And so There's a lot of weapons on that offensive side of the ball, and I think they're going to utilize them quite a bit. They have a pretty solid running back group. The big question mark will be their offensive line and if they're able to make some progress there. But I think in terms of what it looks like, I don't think it's going to look all that much different to the common eye when you look at what they were doing last year and what they're doing this year. Other than, again, I think a more dedicated effort to really truly wanting to be kind of a run first team. And so we'll see how that all plays out. They're still kind of expanding the playbook. They're about midway through training camp now, and they're still installing some new things and trying some new things out. And so we'll see what it looks like over the next couple of weeks, before they go into their opener. But so far, there's not a huge drastic difference from what they were doing last year under Jake Spavital.
And Jaden Ott was first team all Pac-12 running back last year, obviously. Tremendous talent. You mentioned the playmakers offensively in the receiver room, which I definitely want to get more into. But the running back room in particular, I know they brought in some transfers. Kadarius Callaway from ODU is intriguing. Used to be at Bama. ODU. I live in Virginia. ODU is kind of my neck of the woods, sort of. So we're familiar with Callaway. How much run do you think he will get? I mean, Ott is obviously going to demand a bulk of the carries just because of how special of a running back he is. But given the depth that they added to that room, do you think there's going to be an onus to some degree to take a little bit of pressure off Ott, considering kind of the load he had to carry a year ago?
Absolutely. I think that, that was kind of a big part of the offseason. There was talk of even adding another running back late in the process, and that just didn't materialize. But they can go like 6 deep in that running back room. There's a lot of talent within that group. It's been really interesting to see kind of how that number 2 battle has, shaked out a little bit in camp. It really hasn't been decided yet. There's different guys in there. Callaway has been in there quite a bit. Byron Cardwell, who came over from Oregon last year, had a season-ending injury before he really even got to get going. And he looked great in spring ball, when he first arrived from Oregon. The 1-2 tandem of him and Ott was like very, very intriguing. It was, obviously it's practice and you don't really have a chance to truly see them against somebody else. But even in practice, it was like, they have a different dynamic that they're different enough than each other that it's like, it works. And, you have Jaden Ott with the speed, you have Byron Cardwell, who's a little bit bigger guy, had the power. It was like a really, really interesting and intriguing dynamic. He ran into, a serious injury, injured his knee, is now back and healthy. And he's really feeling like, I think if they had a game, coming up this week, it feels like Byron Cardwell might be that second guy, that second running back, kind of has worked himself back into that role. Had an opportunity to play at Oregon and really, performed well there. But now that he's healthy, it feels like he's an option. Javian Thomas is a second-year running back. Last year was able to contribute a little bit as a true freshman. Another guy who has some speed and really can do some different things in the receiving game. I think that's where that's his greatest asset, is he's really been able to help them in the passing game. I think they hope to get Jaden Ott more involved in that. I think that's one thing, if you look at kind of his Cal career up to this point, is he can do so many things. And I think the coaches have really been like, we can't use him everywhere. He returned, his first time ever returning a kickoff in the UCLA game last year. Jaden Ott returned it 100 yards for a touchdown. I mean, that was his first kickoff return. It's like, that's why I would have him out there taking every kickoff. I would have him out there catching passes. But you just can't overuse somebody like that. It's just not going to happen in today's game. And you want to keep him healthy. And so he ran into some injury issues last year and had to miss some time last year. And so you want to keep him healthy. But I think, the Callaway-Cardwell kind of battle is going to be an intriguing one as these, next couple weeks play out and as they get ready for the season, maybe even into the season, because Callaway hasn't been able to be out there completely throughout camp. There's been some days where he's, missed some time, and, Cardwell's kind of caught up and as he, gets back to form and is able to, really kind of get back to full health. And so he's been a really, really intriguing option, like I said. And when you get him out there next to Jaden Ott, or, kind of 1-2 with Jaden Ott, it's a really intriguing lineup and it's a really intriguing look. And so he's somebody I would keep my eye on for sure. Byron Cardwell he's been really impressive again in camp. And again, when you line him up next to Jaden Ott, it's a different look for sure.
Let's take a quick second to remind you about Section103.com. It is the internet's premier place for all things wonderful Georgia Tech apparel. They've got t-shirts, they've got sweatshirts, they've got hoodies, they've got a short sleeve coach hoodie if you want to look like Coach Key. They've got onesies for babies. They've got all things for any man, woman, children, something for the whole family, all the Georgia Tech fans in your life. They need something from Section103.com. Use promo code GOACC for 10% off your first order. You can go get t-shirts supporting NIL efforts with guys like Haynes King and Zach Pyron. They've got shirts supporting the basketball team, the baseball team, the volleyball team, all sorts of wonderful Tech traditions, all sorts of things. Again, any Georgia Tech fan in your life, they need something from section103.com. Once again, use promo code GOACC for 10% off your first order. I particularly love the Feliz Bobby Dodd sweatshirts. We got Christmas season coming up before you know it. You're going to want one of those for your holiday party. Go get it all at section103.com. Huge shout out to Steven and the gang. Thank you so much to them for their support of the Basketball Conference podcast. We would love it if you guys would go show your support for section103.com as well. Now, back to the episode.
Receiving core, I mean, you talked about the tight ends. Having Corey Dyches, having Jack Andrus in the fold is huge, right? Returning production there. Plus, they give you a little bit of something different, right? But Dyches coming in from Maryland gives you a little bit kind of like a change of pace type tight end. But the receiving core is incredibly deep, like you mentioned. You add Tobias Merriweather from Notre Dame. You add Jonathan Brady, an all-conference player at New Mexico State, into the fold. Just to name a few. Who does it seem like, at least in camp, and I know they're going to run deep, they're going to run a bunch of guys out there, but who does it seem like is going to be kind of the first couple wide receivers on the field? And who's going to be throwing them the ball? Like, is Chandler Rogers, is he going to come in and be the starter? Are they going to lean on Fernando Mendoza because, he's got the prior relationship with Blesh, because, Blesh was obviously on staff last year. Is there a little bit of continuity there? What's the quarterback room looking like? And then what's the receiver room looking like? How's that shaking out?
Yeah, I mean, we'll start with the receivers, and it's completely revamped. I mean, Jeremiah Hunter was their top receiver last year. He entered the transfer portal, had graduated from Cal. So the coaching staff was like, hey, if you get your degree from Cal, like we're not going to have any hard feelings. He gave most of his career to Cal, and there were some bad teams that he was part of, and he still kind of went out there and did his thing. And so, but losing a player like that is a big deal. And so, it was tough, I think, for them. They lost a lot of their top guys at the receiver position. They returned Tron Grizel, who was a former walk-on, who really emerged last year in spring last year. And everyone was like, oh, this guy could be a player. And then he comes back and now he's their top returning receiver. And so he'll factor into the equation as well. He's a versatile guy. Started out camp mostly on the outside, but recently got moved to the inside and gave them a different look. Gives them some more size across the board with that first receiver unit. But the two players that really talk about, Tobias Merriweather from Notre Dame.
Yeah.
To me, he was here in the spring, looked pretty good. To me, through the first couple weeks of camp, I'm like, this is a different player. He just looks different than even when he did, in the spring. And so, looks like very much like a wide receiver number one. I mean, he has that part. He's caught a couple 75-yard touchdown passes already during, some of their live periods, and has been consistently getting behind the secondary, the defensive backs. Has been really good about just getting open and being that top target for whoever's throwing him the ball. And so I think he's pretty much, cemented himself as a starter, Tobias Merriweather. Keon Grays came over from Ohio State after the spring. So their receiver group looked like, one way during the spring. You're like, okay, maybe they could use somebody else. They could use another playmaker. They go out and get Keon Grays from Ohio State, where he didn't play much at Ohio State. But if you look at their receiver group, if you're not breaking through at the Ohio State receiver group, it's nothing really against you. You're still probably a pretty talented player. It's definitely okay, because they just have so much talent, in that room. And so he's going to have a better opportunity to get on the field at Cal right now. When he first came in, I think there was some, first couple of days of camp, it's like, hey, let's not give this new guy a starting job right away. So he was kind of with some of the groups behind that. But as camp went on, it really emerged, and it was like, hey, it became very clear, like, hey, this guy should be part of the starting group. So he's been pretty solidified with that starting unit. So I think at this point, Tobias Merriweather, Keon Grays look like they're going to be their two outside guys with the starting unit. The inside spot's going to be interesting. They brought in Mikey Matthews from Utah. He's a second year player, got on the field quite a bit as a freshman at Utah, last fall. Did some things, flashed a little bit, gave them something in the return game. Been a little bit banged up in camp, and so we'll see. I think if he gets back to full health and is able to kind of do his thing as they get more into the season, I think he'll be fine. I think he'll be probably their slot guy. But there's been a couple guys, I mentioned, Tron Grizel being in the slot gives him a different look just because he has some height.
Right.
I think, and it gives you kind of an overall, it's an imposing look when they throw him out there with Tobias Merriweather and Keon Grays. It's a really imposing look for the receiver group. He probably is at this point going to be slotted in as the slot guy, but Mikey Matthews, I'm sure will have something to say about that. Maven Anderson is another player who isn't going to get talked about, who probably isn't known by many fans in the ACC. Hasn't really done a ton in his career at Cal. Kind of one of the veterans who's been through the battles and has really tried to kind of catch on every year. And it just hasn't quite happened for him that he's had that breakthrough season. But he's had a really, really good camp. And you know, one of the byproducts, I think, of bringing in so many transfers, they turned over about half the roster. There's a lot of new guys. There's a lot of new faces. And even after spring ball, there was a lot of guys that came in that you're like, this is not normal. But Justin Wilcox has kind of gone about it that way, where he's like, I don't mind. Like, I'm going to turn over the roster. We're not winning the games we want to win. Like, we're going to turn over the roster. And so there's a lot of new faces. And so one of the things that could happen is like, well, it can cause some friction or it can cause some more competitiveness. And you get guys that have been around who are like, hey, I want to get on the field. And so Maven Anderson has been one of those players who's like taking it to heart, I think, and like, hey, I'm not going to let somebody come in and take my job. And so he's had a really good camp. Mason Starling is another outside receiver. Had a really, really unfortunate career in terms of injuries. When he's been on the field, he's looked great. He was a junior college transfer from the Bay Area. And, you know, when he's been on the field, he's looked great, but he's had so many serious injuries that have kept him out. You know, he's been out for pretty much like a year and a half, almost 2 years now. And so he's looked great in camp. And so he was not somebody I would have picked, you know, before the start of camp. It was like, hey, he's going to be part of this rotation. But he's carved out a role for himself. I think he's going to be, at this point, solidified, you know, spot in that rotation. And then you mentioned Jonathan Brady, who was really a star in the spring. And has kind of maybe gotten a little bit lost in the shuffle, but he has so much versatility to his game. Justin Wilcox has really been praising how much speed they've added to the roster since the end of last season. And Jonathan Brady's part of that group, one of the faster guys in the receiver room. And I think they like that they can play him inside or outside. He's kind of done both throughout camp. And so that's been a really big part of what they wanted to do. And I think he's going to factor in this equation too. And they have a couple freshmen. Trevor Rogers is a track champion here in the state of California, true freshman, really has a ton of speed. He's maybe been their most consistent receiver, and he's worked with the third unit, you know, for most of camp. And so has a ton of touchdowns already in camp, has really showcased his speed. And then Josiah Martin, a player from Texas who came in the spring, really, really shined in the spring, was running with the first unit, you know, in the slot at times, even when Mikey Matthews was healthy. And so for him to do that, for them to have that confidence in him as a true freshman in his first spring, to put him with the starting group says a lot. So he could factor in this equation too. So they can go really deep. And that's kind of the message they've been saying. There's a lot of speed with that group, a lot of talent. And so it'll be really interesting once the season arrives and once games start going, how that all shakes out. Because there's a lot of players that they can use, and there's just not going to be enough time for all of them to play. So we'll see how that shakes out. But to your other point, quarterback position.
Yeah.
It has been really interesting. You talk to people and you're going, it feels like a very Cal situation where you look at camp right now, it feels pretty similar to last year. They had three guys battling it out last year. Fernando Mendoza was the third guy on that list. Throughout camp, he looks like the most consistent quarterback, eventually earns a starting job. Well, flash forward to, you know, this August, there's two guys who have really been in competition since the spring. Fernando Mendoza, who's a returning quarterback. Chandler Rogers coming over from North Texas, who Cal recruited prior to when he went to North Texas. Mike Blesh was his lead recruiter. There is a connection there. So there is a connection there. Cal really wanted him. He took a visit, really liked it, really seemed to be the right fit. And Cal took, you know, Sam Jackson, who's now at Auburn playing receiver. So there were some different things going on there that I think had things shaken out differently. Had he made a decision a little bit quicker, Chandler Rogers maybe was at Cal last year. And so there was already that built-in connection. So he has that kind of bond with Mike Blesh as well. And so it makes for an interesting, kind of intriguing competition. And then you throw in CJ Harris, who they brought in from Ohio after the spring, who has looked like the most consistent quarterback in camp. And so he's been running with his third unit. Again, feels pretty similar to last year when you had Fernando Mendoza, where you go like, because Fernando Mendoza last year, they brought in, you know, Ben Finley last year. They brought him in
ACC, baby, Ben Finley.
And so you said, okay, those are going to be their two guys. It's going to be, you know, Sam Jackson. It'll be Ben Finley. Those are going to, and then Fernando Mendoza looked like the most consistent quarterback throughout camp. And then it was like, I think he might have a chance to play. Well, CJ Harris has now kind of forced himself into the conversation a little bit. He's not, at this point, I would say it's probably a long shot for him to be named the starter, but he's certainly helped himself, you know, throughout camp. I mean, he's been the most consistent quarterback. He's made the most amount of plays. He's been the most productive. He's gotten the team in the end zone the most out of the three quarterbacks. So it's really intriguing, but it still does feel like very much a competition between Chandler Rogers and Fernando Mendoza. If you asked me a week ago who's going to be the starting quarterback, I would say Fernando Mendoza. As we get to the midway point of camp, it's a lot closer, and I'm leaning more towards Chandler Rogers at this point. He's had a really good stretch. It feels like he's kind of in that position or in that stretch of taking over the job. Fernando Mendoza has just been a little bit, not as sharp as he was early in camp. And so it feels like we're in that transition period of like, hey, Chandler Rogers might be taking over this job. And so these next 2 weeks before they head into the opener are going to be very important. We'll see. It feels like internally to me, they want to have a starter named. I don't think they want to go into a situation like they had last year where it was like, oh, we're going to play whoever's out there.
Right.
They kind of tried to force it a little bit by saying, hey, Sam Jackson is our starter. I think it feels like they're going to be a little more definitive. The issue will be is if the players allow that to happen, because if the competition stays close, it could put them in a difficult position where they have to play a couple guys in that game against UC Davis and figure out, okay, who's really going to be the starter. I think talking to people internally, getting a feel for kind of how it's all played out, it feels like I think everyone wants to have, hey, this is our starter, this is who it's going to be, to not have that same situation last year, because that was difficult. That was difficult to watch. I think they could have won some games that they didn't have, won a couple more games if they didn't have that indecision, if they were a little bit more decisive and like, hey, this is our guy. Because again, I don't think if you saw what happened the first 3 games and you saw what happened in camp, if you would have went to Fernando Mendoza a little bit earlier. But obviously when you bring in 2 transfers, the expectation is like, hey, you're going to play one of those 2 guys. And so I think there was, for whatever reason, a little hesitation to go to Fernando Mendoza when he probably could have helped them win a couple more games if he came on earlier on the season. So it's very much a pure quarterback competition. I think sometimes some of those are kind of manufactured in ways where it's coaches just trying to make guys more competitive. That is not the case for Callan this year and in camp so far. It is very close. I've watched every practice, watched all the reps for all those guys. I can tell you legitimately it is a close competition. And right now I'd probably give the edge to Chandler Rogers. But there's still more time for them to decide that. And we'll see when that time comes. I do feel like they're eventually just going to announce a starter and that would be how it goes. But it's a very close race. I mean, I guess you can't count out CJ Harris at this point either, because he's been pretty productive.
It's August, we're recording this on August 12th, and this podcast will come out later this week. But I want to make that known for this particular conversation. Want to remind everybody we're recording on August 12th. So if a starter is named on Tuesday the 13th or Wednesday the 14th, which I don't think Matt is expecting. I'm not expecting it either, but Matt covers the team. He's certainly not expecting a decision in the next 2 or 3 days. But if there's one made and you hear this segment and you already know the answer, that's what happened. It's August 12th when we're recording this. Just want to get that out there, Matt.
And if it's Chandler Rogers, then I can predict the future.
That's right, exactly. Then you nailed it. Congratulations, you nailed it. Okay, so I mean, quarterback seems like it's wide open. Chandler Rogers might be taking that job over. We'll see. Offensive line, I know it's an influx of transfers, but a decent amount of talent coming in, right? So, I mean, there was turnover in the receiver room. There's turnover behind Jaden Ott in the running back room, where there's a lot of guys that they went into the portal to get. I know there's turnover in the quarterback room. Offensive line's no different. They're bringing in a bunch of transfers. So what is this group looking like? Are there more questions about the offensive line than any other unit on the offense? If Cal gets quarterback right, I would guess the answer is yes there.
It might be the biggest question mark on either side of the ball at this point.
Yeah, okay, fair.
And which was not expected. And so that is Mike Blesch's group. He still runs the offensive line, along with being the offensive coordinator. And so it has been intriguing to see how it's played out. It feels like it's not as in good of a place as it was last year. Again, it's mid-camp. There's still more room to grow and for more development to happen before the start of the season. But it's starting to become a bit more of a concern. It hasn't been as solid as you would hope, especially when you have some returners. They've been dealing with some injury things, and they've been dealing with some guys that, they need to get fully healthy again. But I think the other element is you went out and got some players, and those guys haven't necessarily been what you thought so far up to this point. Some guys have been dinged up, and so I think that's kind of been a big part of it as well. The left tackle situation is going to be really interesting. They have Nick Morrow, who's a returner. Didn't play last year. He's a second-year freshman, a redshirt freshman at left tackle, going to be responsible for guarding the blind side. Has never played in a college game. So far, no one's moved him off of his spot. So he's been, the left tackle with the starting group since going back to the spring. They brought in Victor Stoffel from Temple, who looks the part. you go, that looks like a college left tackle. I know he was pretty highly regarded by PFF and highly thought of, but hasn't broken in with the first unit yet. He's still been working with that second group. And so I think the expectation was, he's going to step in and take that left tackle job, and it makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. You have somebody who's played in some games who looks the part. Nick Morrow hasn't let that happen. And so that's kind of the major unknown, is you don't know what it's going to look like at the left tackle spot when you get into a game, because your left tackle's never played a college game yet. And so that's a little bit of a difficult spot for them to be in. They've had some movement, on that left side. The left side is really where the concern is. On the right side, they have TJ Session, who was a transfer from Montana State a couple of years ago, has really been solid for them at that right tackle position. Right guard, Sioape Vadakani, he's been very, very solid at right guard. They also have Will McDonald from Coastal Carolina, from ACC territory, who's come in. And size-wise, I would have been like, I don't think he's going to factor into the equation at all. But he's been working at right guard quite a bit. He could potentially be an option at left guard. And we'll see what happens, because the staff seems to really like him. He's been pretty well cemented in with that first unit on the offensive line. Doesn't necessarily look the part of somebody that, would be playing at a Power 5, Power 4 level, just in terms of size. But, man, his technique is great. He's been really good in terms of what they've needed from that position. And so he's going to be an interesting option, up front as well. And then Bastion Sweeney's kind of a do-it-all guy for them. Started out camp at left guard, has moved to center, has worked center for them before, was their backup center last year. And then Rush Reimer is another Montana State transfer, came in this last offseason, has been slotted in at left guard. So there's some options there, but it's definitely the biggest question mark. And they haven't made the types of improvements that you would hope to see at this point in camp. Again, not saying that can't happen, but the defensive front has been in the backfield quite a bit so far in camp, and that's not good. And it hasn't all been progress from that defensive front. I think they have gotten better. I think their edge rushers have gotten a little bit better, but they've been in the backfield a little bit too often to say that it's just them. The offensive line has had some issues, and there's been some breakdowns. And so, when you have a running back like you have in Jaden Ott, you want that line to be in tip-top shape. When you have a quarterback who's, going to be stepping into the job for the full time for the first time at Cal, you mentioned Fernando Mendoza. Yes, he started games, but this will be his first time playing the entirety of the season, at quarterback. And so you want to have a solid offensive line, and they just don't. It's a question mark for sure. And so we'll see where that all goes. But that's definitely, to me, probably the biggest question across the board for the entire team right now.
Questions at quarterback, questions at offensive line, skill position is going to be really good. Man, we're going to be rolling the dice a little bit. Could be really, really good, or could be something else. We'll see. Defensively, I mentioned this off the top. It's no secret. Justin Wilcox known for the types of defenses he puts together. This is a defensive line and a linebacking core that has a lot of experience, and I feel like this is going to be the strength. If you're looking outside of Jaden Ott, I think this is going to be a strength. The backbone of the team is how they play defensively, especially in the first two levels of the defense. Is that fair to say, number one? And number two, could this be one of the better defensive fronts in the ACC coming in? Because it just feels like they do have a lot of talent, a lot of production, in terms of, what they're bringing back and also what they're bringing into the fold as well.
It's kind of to be determined. They have a lot of bodies. They have a lot of returners. They have a lot of guys that have played games. The issue is going to be, can you find an elite player? David Reese, who came over from Florida last year, really had a strong finish to the season. Ended up getting his sack numbers up really toward the end of the year after not doing a whole lot, in the first portion of the year. He's looked like a different player. He's looked like a true difference maker at that outside linebacker position, which is their edge rushers. That's what they call their edge rushers. They're outside linebackers, even though they're lined up, on the end of the line. He's looked really good. He's looked like the type of player that they need at that position. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that if that defensive front, the two interior linemen, two outside linebackers, if they aren't able to be more productive, this Cal defense is going to be in the same position it was last year, and it's going to be difficult for them to really stop people. And so I think that they need to have growth. It's felt like they started to make that. They too have battled through some injuries up front, and so getting healthy is going to be a big part of it. But And they lost one of their best players, Ethan Saunders from last
Yeah.
year's team, was forced to medically retire. That's a big loss, up front, and somebody that they know they can count on. But they brought in some players as well. TJ Bowlers has been really impressive. He's been running with the first unit on the interior, transfer from Wisconsin. I think he needs to be even probably more productive in making plays. He's eating up space and been able to take on blockers, but it feels like they need him to kind of be more productive, get more tackles, get into the backfield a little bit more. But Xavier Carlton, David Reese are going to be their playmakers on the edges, and those guys need to have better seasons. They need to play at almost an elite level for this Cal defense to shine. They have some bodies in the back end, in the secondary. I think that are going to be. Noel Williams has been very, very impressive. Had a ton of interceptions last year. Marcus Harris, who was at Oregon State originally, ended up going to Idaho for last season, and now is transferred to Cal. Was really, really impressive. Has kind of an All-American appeal about him.
Yeah.
Ton of speed. So they're going to be fine on the corners. But yeah, and the safeties are going to be maybe another issue, and they're going to have to figure that out. There's some guys that are returning that they're trying to kind of, see, are those going to be the guys? Or they brought in a ton of new talent. They brought in Ryan Yates from LSU. They brought in Josiah Wagner from Oklahoma at the safety positions. And are those guys going to factor in this equation at all? Or are they going to kind of go back to Craig Woodson, Miles Williams, who have been kind of their guys the last couple of years? So some things to figure out there. But linebacker is kind of where they feel solidified. Kedu Luave was a revelation last year, a true freshman. This time last year was actually taking running back reps in camp. That's how far back down on the linebacker depth chart he was. He was working with the running backs. And so the fact that he eventually became the Pac-12 Defensive Freshman of the Year was pretty insane.
Yeah.
Because he just was not high up on the depth chart during camp. Some injuries happened. They lose Jackson Sermon, who is the son of defensive coordinator Peter Sermon. He was their leading tackler, really the heart of the defense. Lose him about midway through the year. Injury things happen. Kedu Luave is suddenly called into action. He is a star. And so he looks much better. He looks improved. He looks more confident. He looks bigger. He looks like he's ready to have a very, very successful season, kind of building off of last year. And then they bring in Teddy Buchanan from UC Davis. An FCS transfer, was really, really productive during his time at UC Davis. He looks the part. He looks like one of the transfers you want to bring in and say, yeah, you're just going to drop him in. He's going to have a ton of tackles. So that tandem of Kedu Luave, Teddy Buchanan, looks like it's going to be the strength, kind of the heart of their defense. I think they're going to have to be. I think you're going to have to look at what those guys do, and they're going to have a lot of the production is going to have to come from those two guys. And then, like I said, the edge rushers. I think a lot is going to be put on the edge rushers, and I do think there's talent there. I think there's, especially at the top end with the top of the rotation, depth could be a concern. At the edge rushing, at the outside linebacker position, even on the interior, their depth could be a concern. Even though it feels like they have returners and bodies, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that Cal's defense will go as far as its defensive line takes it. And that's going to be the key this year. I think they have to get pressure. They have to be better about getting pressure. They have to get sacks and tackles for losses. They know that. They've talked about that throughout the spring, throughout camp. The defensive line understands, like, hey, this defense isn't going to work no matter what we have going on behind us with the linebackers, no matter what we have at the corner positions, unless they do their job. And so if you want to see how successful Cal is going to be defensively this year, you don't have to look much farther than the first four guys. I mean, the defensive front is going to be where it's at. If those guys are more productive and look like they're, creating havoc and being disruptive, that's going to be a great, great sign for Cal and its defense this year.
It feels like I'm just previewing Syracuse again. I did the Syracuse preview last night. It was like, all right, if they figure out offensive line and defensive line, and if the quarterback is as good as they think, they seem to have everything else in place. It just feels like I'm doing that preview all over again. Let's take a look at the schedule. And if you're going to come over to the ACC, it does feel like you could have been done a little bit more of a solid and not drawing Florida State and Miami. That's kind of tough. You do avoid Clemson, so I guess that's a feather in your cap, I suppose. But you got to play Florida State and Miami before the second week of October. I don't think that's particularly good. But then I think the rest of the schedule is kind of workable. Yeah, there are some tough teams. Obviously, got to go to Auburn in week 2. That's a tough road trip. But yeah, you got the Florida State and the Miami game. NC State, you host them, right? So I think NC State's got a chance to be pretty good in the ACC, but you host them. You got the rivalry game with Stanford towards the end of the year. You still have Oregon State on the schedule. And then you go to SMU to cap the year off. it's not an impossible schedule, right? But there are some tough spots in there where I could see where Cal fans could be, okay, a little bit bullish because of, what the Golden Bears have offensively and what they have returning and Jaden Odd and the playmakers at receiver and what you expect the defense to be just because it's a Justin Wilcox defense versus like, hey, we got to go to Florida State at the end of September, right? We then come off a bye week and have to host Miami, and we got Stanford still on the schedule, and they'll be pesky, and we got NC State that's going to be, it's one of the dark horse contenders in the ACC. Feels like a pretty rough schedule to me, Matt, and that's before you even talk about the Auburn game in week 2.
Yeah, I mean, AP Top 25 dropped this week, and there are three of their first 4 ACC matchups are against teams that are ranked in the preseason Top 25.
Not great.
No rewards there for Cal in their first season in the ACC. No favors. But it's tough. I mean, it's a tough schedule. We're going to learn a lot about this Cal team, and it feels very much like, at least in my mind, and I think we'll talk about, predictions and all that for the season, but it feels like it could be very similar to last season where they really kind of struggle out of the gate and then they figure it out in the second half of the season. Obviously, a little bit easier stretch of the schedule, maybe an opportunity to figure it out. I think internally it feels like there's been a couple mentions, a couple thoughts of like, hey, man, if that schedule is flipped, this could be a different type of season. If you get a chance to kind of ramp up and play some of those teams later in the year, you're going to feel better about it. But to come out of the gate, with those teams and to play Florida State on the road to open things up and then play Miami and then you have NC State, not long after that, it's a difficult road. I think, and it's kind of been the talk internally, it feels like the Auburn game is going to really tell the tale about what this Cal team we think can be. Yeah. If you go out there and it's going to be a difficult game to win, if you're able to win it, I think it sends your season on a different course altogether.
Right, agree.
But if you're able to hang with Auburn, at least show that you're competitive, I think it gives you some confidence. You go into that San Diego State game, in the last game of non-conference play, you assume that's going to be a victory for Cal. And then you go into Florida State, and again, it's like, okay, you're feeling okay. You're 2-1. You hung with Auburn on the road, feeling okay about where you're standing going into Florida State. It's going to be a different challenge than what they had faced at any point in that season so far. But again, if you're able to kind of build some confidence and compete with Florida State, then it maybe gives you some more confidence going into that next week, and you can build a different type of season. But if you go to Auburn and it's not even competitive and you get beat pretty badly, it could be real dicey for Cal this season because it just doesn't get any easier after that, and until you get to the second half of the season, and who knows what type of team you are by that point in the year. And so, it's the challenging schedule is going to be a difficult thing for them to get over, and so. I think a lot is it's tough to say because they're only going to be, you only would have played UC Davis at that point. What does that really tell you about your team? But I think that a lot of what this season could be is going to hinder on what happens, at Auburn.
I agree as far as overall trajectory and kind of what that game looks like. I think is going to tell the tale. A few swing games, just outside of the really tough games, a couple swing games at Pitt. Welcome to the ACC. Nobody likes going to play at Pittsburgh, right? It's at the venue formerly known as Heinz Field. Nobody enjoys going to play there. It's just like a weird, dreary atmosphere, and it feels like nobody ever goes to Pitt and plays well. So welcome to the ACC, coming off of Miami and having to go to Pitt. So Pitt feels like a swing game. NC State feels like a swing game. And then I think that the two closing games, Stanford and SMU, seem like pretty important games, especially considering what Cal has at the front half of the schedule. To me, it does still feel like Cal's got enough talent to get to a bowl game, even with this tough schedule. I think there's enough winnable games on the schedule. I just don't know. I don't know that they're going to win all of them to get to 7 or 8 wins, just considering how tough the schedule is. But I feel like outside of the handful of tough games that I think Cal will enter as an underdog or have a chance to be an underdog, NC State, Miami, Florida State, and Auburn. If you pick off one of those, yeah, you probably do win 7, but then it's a matter of, do you beat Pittsburgh on the road? Do you go into Wake Forest and have a mature performance on a Friday night on the road? It's a weird game, right? I think I'm leaning towards 6-6. I think Cal goes to a bowl game. It would surprise me if they didn't, given all the talent that they have on the roster. I think they have enough to figure it out. This is just a really tough and odd schedule. This is one of the weirder schedules I've seen. I've done a bunch of these previews. They have like a handful of teams left. This is one of the weirder schedules I've seen in terms of like how it's laid out. Get 2 Florida teams back-to-back sandwiched around a bye week. Just a very odd schedule. Auburn in week 2 on the road. It's just how it's laid out is very weird, and I think you made a really good point about if this schedule is flipped and you can kind of ramp up, maybe you feel a little bit differently about it.
Yeah, and you have to throw in there the travel. I mean, they're going to be traveling a lot. Justin Wilcox had mentioned that, and he's like, hey, we got the biggest plane, and we're going to have some lay-down seats, and we're going to do with it what we can. But you just don't know how that's going to play out when you're traveling across the country as much as Cal is going to have to do this year. And so we'll see what that all means. But, yeah, I'm kind of with you. I'm thinking 6-6 is kind of where they're going to lie. I think, it feels like another bowl game season. I just don't know. There's too many question marks for me at key spots to be like, yeah, they're going to, excel and get back over 500.
Yeah.
Which they've been trying to do since, 2019 and just hasn't happened yet. And so I just don't, there's too many question marks for me. And so we'll see what happens. We'll see how it all plays out. But I think I'm with you with 6-6. I think if everything falls in place, I think 8-4 is possible, maybe.
Yeah.
But I'm with you at 6-6 right now.
Yeah. I think it's fair. I think it'll be a successful year one if Cal gets to a bowl game, just given how the schedule's laid out. It's one of those years too where like you just don't know what to expect as a team entering the conference with all the travel. Nobody's ever seen this done before, so I mean we're all going to kind of figure that part of it out together. I think with the West Coast schools, and not just the West Coast schools, but a lot of the East Coast ACC schools.
There's flights that go the opposite way.
I was going to say they got travel out there too. So we're gonna figure that part of it out together. I think we'll have a much better handle on it 2 or 3 years from now. Versus where we're at here entering year one and how that's going to go and how teams are going to plan with the logistics, which I think is another very interesting part of the equation now is logistically, how is it going to work? Are teams going to fly out and then just stay on the East Coast, which I think is going to happen some, or vice versa. If you got a couple West Coast games, you're going to stay on the West Coast. I'm interested to see each program's approach to that portion of the scheduling. I think that's going to be interesting, and see if there's any sort of data a few years from now indicating that one method works better than the other. I'm sure each school will it's going to be a pick your own poison thing, I think. Matt, really appreciate it. I want to give you an opportunity to plug where you're at, and we'll definitely have you on again. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. You can check us out at Cal Rivals on Twitter, at Golden Bear Report, or cal.rivals.com. You can check me out at Matt R. Moreno on Twitter, or X, I guess is what it's called now. Make sure you check out our coverage. I'll be there for the remainder of camp. Cal, I have to give them credit. They give us open access to practice, and so I'm able to watch every single practice, which you don't find everywhere across the country. And so I've been able to watch everything so far from throughout the spring, throughout training camp. So I have a pretty good feel of what things are looking like up to this point. So make sure you check in with us and check out all our coverage every day with practice reports and videos and all that good stuff.
Yeah, Matt does a great job tweeting out video. We've been following him on the podcast account for like a week. I found you with my personal Twitter account as I was just looking for Cal people to maybe reach out to and interview. And it felt like there was a lot of open practice time. So it's very cool that the media gets an inside look at a lot of the practices there. That's something that Justin Wilcox does that I know a lot of programs, especially in the ACC, don't do. So that's very cool. Matt, we appreciate it, man. We'll have you back on soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
All right, we'll be back. More season previews. Follow us on Twitter at BC Podcast ACC. Hit us up on YouTube, youtube.com/@the ACC Football Podcast. We'll be back soon. We're winding down on our season previews. Until next time, go ACC.